Okay, hello, good morning. Today we will be discussing chapter 6 of Dimock's legal philosophy that has to do with feminist jurisprudence and the different branches of feminism and what Catherine Dimock, whose ideas are really concentrated in this article, had to say about this. Okay, so my name is Hannah Levin. I'll be the lecturer today to just give you like a brief overview of like what we'll be discussing. But yeah, let's get right into it. Okay, first of all, when we're discussing the topic of legal philosophy and specifically legal feminist jurisprudence in legal philosophy, we need to understand the fundamental question of what is patriarchy and why should we care? Because patriarchy is really key to understanding why there's feminist jurisprudence in the first place. Because because feminist jurisprudence uses legal philosophies to deal with the questions of like why patriarchy controls society and women and affects the law and how it's applied. But that requires that we even know what patriarchy is to begin with. Okay, so what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is an idea that is completely male centric in that it believes that men as a gender are superior to women and that it is somehow innate to them, and because it is innate, they are above women in the social hierarchy, and so it's male centric. It's about power dynamics that ultimately construct a status quo of inequality that ultimately perpetuates unequal access for women. And so it really ties into the issue of like, hey, is patriarchy moral? Because there is something just highly paternalistic about it that says no, like women should be under men, but then a lot of times it's twisted that no, women are subservient to men because it is good for them and we're putting women under their care. So patriarchy is the dominant theme that feminist jurisprudence argues from because where feminist jurisprudence is going to examine how patriarchy in different ways affects law and women's access and opportunity in society. And so, feminist jurisprudence? The short way we could put it is legal practice and theory and the laws that get shaped through feminist thought, an application of feminist theory towards shaping the law. And so, application of feminism to law, essentially, because feminist jurisprudence essentially points out that hierarchy in society, historically to the present day, does minimize women's position in relation to that held by men. Therefore, this jurisprudence is concerned with the impacts on laws as patriarchy has shaped the legal system and how society operates into ultimately creating the status quo of how we view issues and solutions from a masculine perspective. And so, like, a good quote that Catherine McKinnon would have said to support this is that she explained that feminist jurisprudence is the analysis of law from the perspective of all women. I think that's a really good way to just summarize the three branches, but we'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so like now we've answered like what is feminist jurisprudence? It's how the law has different how there's different branches of feminism that address the law and access to inequality. Okay, we'll discuss patriarchy's legal cores. Okay, first of all, before we get into discussing the three branches of feminism, we need to understand patriarchy's legal cores now that we've already explained what patriarchy is. There's the descriptive and the empirical, which is social constructs that ultimately benefit men through normalizing their domination of women, and therefore uses male serving expectations for an unequal status quo to subjugate the women under them. This perpetuates patriarchy in society because it's creating a gendered hierarchy. So, basically, what it is saying is that it's social constructs that normalize how women are being treated. And a social construct is basically just like how society has created different rules and things to represent something else. Like, for example, you could say that money is a social construct, but it has value and power of enforcement because people take it seriously and they treat it as if they have value. So it perpetuates it. Like, if everyone decided that, hey, a $50 bill wasn't worth it, $5 bills weren't worth it, they didn't trust the value of money and go along with using money to buy and sell and create transactions, money would lose its power. So basically, social constructs under patriarchy are like that. They're just things that people accept as true and must have value either because it serves them or because people are like sheep, they go along with it. And so it's like an unwritten rule that basically establishes power and control over society. Like in patriarchy, an example of like a social construct would be women wearing makeup, or the fact that women have to have long hair as like a sign of femininity. There's nothing innately feminine about having long hair. It's just the social construct that we put on women, at least like in America. Like Samson in the Bible, he had long hair, and men have hair naturally. So there's nothing natural necessarily about the social construct of women typically being associated with having long hair. So yeah, I hope I under explained that well enough. But yeah, that goes on to the normative thesis, which is another legal core of patriarchy that feminist jurisprudence deals with. Okay, the normative thesis is about the branches within feminism and how they disagree and differ within their theories of how patriarchy leverages control and both opportunities and outcome for women and societies. Hence, this legal core basically emphasizes norms in our society, which creates the social construct. So that ties back into the descriptive and empirical. So it's important to know both. Norms in society are basically like what norms are. They're the attitudes, they're the social constructs, but norms are basically attitudes and thoughts that are perpetuated in society that drive behavior. So, for example, it's considered a social norm to wear socks with your shoes. So if you're walking around with sneakers like I do and just like skip socks because you're too lazy to go get a pair, yeah, that's kind of like not a social norm. That's kind of like you're kind of violating a social norm by doing something that is inconsistent with expected patterns of behavior that other people do. Okay, so that has a lot to do with feminism because with feminism, you're basically arguing against the status quo of a norm of women being subservient and having less opportunities. That used to be the norm. Women wouldn't have their own credit cards. They wouldn't be able to engage in society outside of the home. They wouldn't be able to enter into contracts, that sort of thing. Okay, so that is just the gist of the normative thesis. Okay, and so that goes on to how does feminist jurisprudence relate to these legal cores and what are the main branches and types of feminism? Now that we've talked about patriarchy's legal cores. Okay, well, I tie, okay, so there's a few branches of feminism that I'll discuss. There's liberal feminism, radical feminism, Marxist, aka socialist feminism, and then postmodern, which is also known as French feminists. And then there's relational feminism. And basically, jurisprudence of these specific branches ties into the empirical and the normative because like liberal feminism, for example, like I'll get back and I'll just start with one example. Like radical feminism has to do with thoughts and ideas in society. So that would count as something that is like more like normative. So radical feminism as a branch would fall under the normative thesis of feminism. And like Marxist socialist feminism would be more under like descriptive and empirical because it has to do with like unequal access but social constructs. So I'll just start with those two, but I think before I even really tell you more about the descriptive and empirical, specifically relating to each branch, I think students should understand what the branches are to begin with. So I'll do that. Okay. So in liberal feminism, it is essentially the original and classic feminism. So when you think of like the original suffragettes, they're just marching for equality and wanting the right to vote because you had legal barriers that were preventing them from having the same opportunities as other people. That is exactly like what feminism is. It's just thinking, hey, the claim is, hey, if we eradicate social barriers to women, there will be equal opportunity. And so it's basically a critique about how meritocrat I'm getting stuck. How merit like can be like more realistic. But the social issue is that the social issue is liberal feminism argues that it's disadvantage in society that perpetuates a social issue, and it's not necessarily like our innate gender differences. So basically, the block to gender equality is the law and the status quo. So like another way, like you could basically say is like, hey, this type of feminism wants gender blindness regarding access and ability to for women to have equal opportunity through the law. And so it says that sex differences are completely irrelevant and differentiating factors when justifying the patriarchal status quo. And so it's disadvantage over difference. It's the level of disadvantage instead of difference that creates inequality and so social reform that gets rid of this inequality through social barriers is the ideal legal objective. Okay, for radical feminism. Okay, this is masculine institutions, thoughts, attitudes, those are the sort of things that radical feminism claims is like what ultimately restricts women and binds them to the patriarchy. And so, since norms, which are fueled by thoughts and attitudes, it is these norms that are responsible for driving and enforcing a patriarchal status quo. And so gender expression really falls into this. Like that goes back into my example of like the hair length, or like makeup, that sort of thing. Those could all be things that maybe are used to sexualize women in society, but I'll talk about sexualization later. But those are all things in society that are used to sexualize women and like maybe factor into their oppression. But yeah, the top prioritized issues under radical feminism is sex, sexual violence, and issues of like gender and sexuality, such as like LGBT issues, motherhood, so like when to have kids, when to prevent kids, like so access to contraception and abortion, that sort of thing, holding rapists accountable, and sexual harassment in the workplace. So when you think of like Title IX and like anti-sexual harassment laws, like anti-sexual harassment laws under Title IX would be like an example of like laws that came and were influenced and driven through radical feminism. And it also has a lot to do with like pornography. So, hey, does pornography harm women or empower them? So it's like that sort of debate. So basically, by focusing on thoughts and attitudes and like institutions, which is like family is an institution. um it's believing that these things in society, they're immaterial, they're not completely physical, like it, it's not necessarily laws blocking women from doing things, but it's attitudes and patterns of behavior that are basically harming women and binding them and making them subservient and less than men under a patriarchy, instead of like women necessarily having less legal equality. It's about like laws that don't protect women from like harassment or access to reproductive rights. So basically, it's basically what the law doesn't do to protect women and what society glamorizes or perpetuates that is basically oppressing women, and not necessarily less of like equal opportunity in society to pursue careers, jobs, education. So it's like a bit more nuanced because like it says like oppression and inequality and outcomes in society are fueled by this patriarchal power instead of like legitimate biological differences. And so like gender expression is the foundation for the root of male power. Okay, and then we go into like Marxist and socialist feminism. Okay, so like in Marxist and socialist feminism, it's all about economics and like monetary value that women have placed on them, and like how their work and contribution to the home and with this private sphere contributes to inequality. So, for example, like when you think of the opportunity cost that women often acquire, like after they have a baby, childcare is extremely expensive. So then they're like, hey, I'm going to have to be a stay-at-home mom and maybe like give up my career, even like if I don't want to. Like a Marxist or a socialist feminist would say, hey, well, we don't have good maternal paid leave in the United States for mothers or good health care access. So that's all that it is just like a way we devalue them and ultimately keep them out of the market. Or the women who do stay home, they're not being compensated by the government, or when they do enter the workplace later on, they're like the employer will be like, hey, you have an absence of all of this work experience. And so, like, what have you been doing? And the employer isn't valuing all of that work experience and effort and time that went into taking care of their family and their children and their home. Because, like, this type of branch of feminism is basically saying that, hey, women's roles in society under the patriarchy are being devalued. So motherhood is basically being devalued by men, and that women ultimately are oppressed and need to have more economic freedom and ability to support themselves, because whenever they have been operating under the status quo of capitalism and this private sphere of just like doing free labor in the home and for the community, men have abused that opportunity and economic dependence placed on men to basically control women and keep them from upward mobility and other opportunities in society. So basically, it's saying that, hey, capitalism under the patriarchy doesn't value women's work and labor that basically makes society go around, that it only values the labor that men does, that men get paid for. Okay, when it comes to like postmodern and like French feminism, it's basically more of like an umbrella term in a sense. Like it's called French feminism because like a lot of the feminist theorists who it really were strong proponents of it, they were French or they were French themselves. So yeah, it's kind of like the word's nickname, but it's more like, okay, postmodern. And postmodern is basically like, hey, we're going to holistically look at feminism. We're not going to say it's just the economy or just social norms and attitudes or just inequality as put into law. It's not those things individually that is responsible for oppressing women in society and like keeping them subjugated under a patriarchy. Postmodern feminism is saying, hey, no, all of those different three branches that I discussed have merit and are all different factors that are used together in combination to like harm women in society and make them less than men. So it's a skeptic essentially of isolating any feminist theory, and so is more holistic, comprehensive of like why and how patriarchy and gender is perpetuated in society. And so therefore it's logocentric because like it really challenges the status quo established by patriarchy and really questions the legitimacy of trusting the accuracy of the male perspective. So it's basically yeah, it's basically that. And then it's the deconstruction of gender bias. One moment. Okay. And so basically, like deconstruction of gender bias is the idea that, hey, people are going to, no, women need to question the assumptions that have perpetuated the status quo because the status quo is patriarchy. So, like, why are we accepting certain premises as necessarily being correct or normal? So, like, what it's basically questioning and challenging the innate thesis of like men naturally following higher up in the hierarchy and like women being lower on the totem pole per per se. So basically, it's just challenging like why maybe like we make certain assumptions based on gender and create stereotypes based on that. It's basically challenging that. Okay, and then when it comes to relational feminism, I honestly think this is kind of more of like slightly conservative view of it because it does acknowledge gender differences in like specifically psychological ones that derive from biology, but it's saying that, hey, women don't have less worth and should not have less opportunity in society. It's just that men and women psychologically view morality and maybe their approach to ethics and solutions a bit differently, and that there's a place for that, and it actually makes society stronger including like in the workplace of like careers, law, things that are traditionally male dominated. And so women shouldn't have to be forced to act like men, but they should be accommodated and being um like included into those spheres and to have those patriarchally dominated institutions recognize their value instead of saying that, hey, no, we're going to exclude you based on your gender. And if you want to be competitive in here, like you need to start acting like a man and basically change who you are as a woman. Like relational feminism is not saying that. It's saying that women are empowered when their innate differences are valued and are associated with strength instead of as being like like a subordinated like weakness that is considered as like lesser than the traits that are typically like associated with like men. Okay, so relational feminism has to do with moral development, the moral development hypothesis of gendered prioritizations and ethics. And so basically, this was the ideas I just said that the different genders often may have different perceptions and like of how they view the pursuit of justice and um how to like implement different solutions in like law and society. So basically, it starts with these two. There's the ethic, the hypothesis basically says there's two different versions of ethics that if you're a male, you're more likely prone to, or if you're a female, you're more likely to be associated with. So like if you're a male, you're associated with like the ethic of justice, which is basically that the ethic of justice has to do with like abstract rules, principles, and rights. So something that is like kind of like more black and white. It's less nuanced thinking. So it's basically more of like law and order and like specific things that you can point to. Um, so that is considered as like more a masculine thought process, like something that is stereotypically, yes, it is stereotypical, considered as like more I don't want to say logical or analytical, but um compartmentalized per se. Like maybe the author who was thinking of the moral development thesis was thinking, hey, men just compartmentalize themselves a bit more. So there's more of like a clear distinction line of like what to point to when it comes to like the law. So like it's very black and white and specific when it comes to principles and abstract laws and like what are rights or and what are not rights. That's just my understanding of what maybe ethic of justice is supposed to mean. But ethic of care, which is like female associated, is basically like it focuses on like concrete relationships, concern for others, and responsibility. So like love, sympathy, patience, and concern, and uses those concerns for like sympathy, love, patience, um, having positive relationships and like taking care of others into like how we implement laws and policies. So like should we have like a strong social safety net? Should we care about like, hey, how if you get rid of contraceptives, how that's going to disproportionately affect women? What about the homeless population? What are the different policies out there that are affecting those groups of people? Like, how can we serve veterans better? Like, you could say the thought process of like, hey, how can we keep others from suffering through our laws and approach to creating policies of society as being more of like an ethic of care. So like female centric based on this like psychosocial hypothesized model of like relational feminism. Okay. And then pragmatism. That leads into pragmatism. Basically, pragmatism definitely ties into feminist jurisprudence because and like definitely ethic of justice and ethic of care because it's very contextual, practical, and personal. So like what does that mean? It's kind of like seeing the value of both the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. Because like relational feminism says, hey, ethic of care is valuable, but so is ethic of justice. It's both male and female perspectives that are valuable and have a place in law and society. And so we should not devalue the feminine virtues that are associated with women. So it's saying that, hey, we look at the context of different issues and like, hey, what are potential practical solutions to make very personalized, to try to generate like more personalized results in society. So, yeah, so basically it's anti-essentialist. It's saying, hey, like, no, we should not, we should challenge the status quo and shouldn't just accept the gender hierarchy and how men perceive as solutions as like the way things are or the way it should be. So basically it's a conflict resolution tool of like deciding, hey, how are we going to try to think of situations with a lot of nuance, but like use like our tools for like conflict resolution of like they're mental. They're like it's basically saying that, hey, under pragmatism, you're just thinking about like what is the best route or perspective to figure out issues in society, and then how are we going to get there using like by looking at the context and what would be logical solutions, and then implementing how ethic of justice and ethic of care can be used um as the routes and like tools or like the no like the ways the modes of thinking on how to fix an issue. Like I'm not the best at explaining that, but it definitely ties into like ethics and challenging like the status quo of like what perspective we're going to go with when it comes to trying to find the solutions for um different social like issues in society. Okay, and then there's the sameness versus difference debate that definitely stems out of relational feminism and like so basically sameness versus difference debate is like, hey, yeah, women do have biological differences that make them valuable in society, but those biological differences have also been like different areas that have negatively impacted women because it disproportionately just impacts them. Like men don't really have to worry about the effects of pregnancy, for example. And like there maybe if you're like a white if you're like a white man, you're less likely to have different stereotypes versus like if you're a white woman with blonde hair, like you're going to have different stereotypes about you. And then if you're like, hey, if a woman gets pregnant, hey, there may be more barriers as far as like physical if she gets pregnant versus like a man. Like he could have sex with a whole bunch of women and it's not going to negatively impact his life opportunities and choices the same way it would a woman. So basically, like different differences, um, different issues that can only affect women can be used as a way to control them or limit their opportunities in society. So, yeah, basically, and like the sameness versus difference debate, um, yeah, it's basically about, hey, women have different biological differences, but we shouldn't use these biological differences to like reinforce different stereotypes because that's just not a good idea. We should not be doing that. But basically, so basically women should be accommodated into these different like okay, and then okay, the next thing that we have to go into is like the post. Wait, I just did the postmodern. Did I? I did. Where is it? Postmodern. Oh yeah, and then definitely this the sameness versus difference debate. It ties into the postmodern critique that I already talked about up here when it came to like not isolating just feminist theories, but viewing them holistically together instead of just singularly on their own. That definitely ties into the postmodern critique because it's basically saying that, hey, like sometimes a social issue, like pregnancy, that could be affected by, let's just say, the economy. So the economy, if women don't have good access to healthcare, they're poor, they're less able to work. So then, yeah, that would definitely be like a social issue that has to do with that has to do with monetary capital that would oppress women. So, but like the postmodern critique would also say that from my perspective, it would seem that it would kind of reject liberal feminism because liberal feminism just says it's the the strong deviations between like it's the legal barriers between men and women that keep women oppressed. Whereas like postmodern critique would like be definitely rejecting that because it's saying that no, women do have different i- issues that biologically impact them that men don't. So men and then women do have different values in society, but some women are going to be affected more than others on different issues. Okay, one second. And so basically on the sameness versus difference debate, it would basically say that what's my next slide? Okay. Okay, and then okay, that goes on to my next slide. Overall objectives of feminism and jurisprudence. Okay, the overall objectives of feminism and jurisprudence. Okay, so I already discussed what feminist jurisprudence is. So I think after we've already discussed the different branches, hey, the ideas about how differences psychologically and biologically that create different conditions like pregnancy, that's an innate condition to women that men never have to experience. So that's like a biological difference. But then we had, hey, different perspectives that men and women have because, like, sometimes their positions in society can affect how they see the world. That was like under relational feminism and ethics. And then, like, we talked about, hey, the different branches right here: liberal, radical, Marxist, postmodern, and relational. Um, and that all basically, like now that we know that information about those branches, that all ties back into fe the overall objectives of feminist jurisprudence that like across the board, hey, like what is something that really ties all these different branches of like feminism together? Okay. Well, what really ties feminist jurisprudence together is the fact that irregardless of whether you're a radical, liberal, Marxist, relational, postmodern, feminist, like you all believe that, hey, it's the patriarchy in society that keeps women oppressed. So, well, because it's the patriarchy that keeps women oppressed, that decides what feminist jurisprudence objectives are. And so feminists' overall objectives are, irregardless of like what type of feminist you identify, like the common like underlying principle is that, hey, you need to critically question and then thoughtfully attempt to understand society in order to make a positive difference. And so it is this critical thoughtfulness and like questioning of like the status quo that is reflected and reinforced through patriarchy that can ultimately lead to cultural shifts and like ultimately a cultural revolution as far as like gendered expectations for women and like sex equality. So the whole idea is to make people rethink the roles and the positions and the value of women in society, not only how they perceive women and how that shapes how women are treated in society, but also like what they're legally allowed to do and like what opportunities they're given. And so unconscious and conscious biases and stereotypes aren't used to restrict women, even if there's like, yeah. So that is the way that feminist jurisprudence wants to perpetuate um, the flourishing of all of humankind by recognizing that irregardless of like sex, gender, like that everyone is fundamentally equal. And even if you do have some differences, those differences are still valuable and one isn't less than another. And so it wants to create like a legal, a social, like a socio-legal framework in society that serves the majority of both like men and women together. It doesn't just prioritize or disproportionately benefit men. It should be like a basic standard that is both good for male and female. And so, like as I said on my slide, like the goal is to aspire for an application of social legal standards that flourish everyone. So basically, everyone is being watered under feminist jurisprudence. It's not about prioritizing men over women, and it's not about prioritizing women or over men because like hey, often a question that is really posed when it comes to like feminist jurisprudence and probably like a misunderstanding about feminism is that women want extra privileges in society. Like feminist jurisprudence isn't saying give women extra privileges because they were oppressed. What it is saying is that hey, the sexism needs to stop and men figuratively need to get their feet off of the necks of women. So then women have more opportunity. So more opportunity for like women. So gender inequality does not mean less opportunity for men. It just means that there the double standards have been like evened out. And so like it's a more fair playing field where people's talents and abilities and their aspirations like have more of like a fair shot at success. Okay. And then, okay, there's McKinnon's magic mirror analogy for the law under patriarchy. Okay. Basically, McKinnon's magic mirror analogy for the law under patriarchy is basically saying that, hey, the current social climate that in societies that women live under, like when you look at the conditions of women and children and like the outcomes for them, that is honestly just like a reflection of what how women are valued in society. So when you look at the outcomes, you can be like, no, that's a mirror reflecting the status, that's a mirror reflecting male dominance being the status quo under law. So basically, it's saying that it ties a magic mirror to like an outdated patriarchal status quo that's being reflected through like a because like a patriarchal perspective is distorting the vision of social reality. Yeah, so basically feminist jurisprudence like wants to update this mirrored status quo. And so it's basically just saying, hey, like the outcomes and effects of people in society can be mirrored like figuratively. Like you can just see it being reflected and like how patriarchal attitudes and expectations view women. So basically, yeah, like if you see negative outcomes for women, it's because it's being reflected off of um sexist, patriarchal, misandrist attitudes that perpetuate male dominance as being the status quo, as I said on my slide. Because, like, as I asked on my side, does the law perpetuate male dominance as the status quo? Because, like, it's basically shedding light on the fact that male supremacy is like an objective standard issue that warps perceptions of neutrality because, like, McKinnon is basically saying that, hey, it's it's a warped perception that, hey, how it's warped that male supremacy has convinced society that it's just the male perspective that is logical and neutral, and so therefore is unfairly perceived as being objective. And so somehow men are being considered more logical when they really aren't. That is just like a social construct, as I talked about before. Okay, and then some of the other things that Catherine McKinnon really discussed in Standing Doctrine was this. Like, understanding doctrine, it's basically the idea that, like, women are being oppressed in society because, like, they don't have enough social capacity together, or it's like since they're not individually affected as just like an individual on they're not like an isolated case being affected by like pornography or rape or sexism, that they can't really sue, or like they can't really sue or say that, hey, I'm being targeted, because it's women as a group that are being targeted. So then it's a lot easier to brush it under the rug, per se. So basically, so it's like systemic sexism and like sexual violence, for example, um, that make it hard for women to sue because they're a group. And then there's the state action requirement. Okay, which is like a private actor's dilemma. So that this has to do with more of like liberal feminism. State action requirement, I think, would definitely tie back into like liberal feminism as what I had talked about social barriers to women that prevent equal opportunity and therefore equality in society. The state action requirement has to do with, really, in my opinion, and understanding like liberal feminism, because under state action requirement, which is like a constitutional law sort of thing, is basically saying that, hey, it's okay that sometimes like private corporations or just private parties are sexist and discriminatory, because state action requirement basically argues that people are only constitutionally protected against the government and not by third parties. So basically, it's like a third party doctrine where third parties are exempted and permitted to like oppress and like discriminate against women. Whereas like the government, it's saying, isn't allowed to. So state action requirement is basically something that can affect women because women, based on stereotypes and preconceived notions about women's roles in society, can be used to discriminate against them, even if it's like more subtle. Okay. And then how these relate to dominance and subordination, like the different branches of feminism and legal access. Well, in dominance and subordination, um, it's basically saying that, hey, men have the upper hand and like women are subordinated in their roles. And so due to like the different branches of feminism arguing that women have different access and don't have gender equality in society, that that really just goes back to the where is it? The sameness difference debate of specific issues disproportionately impacting women. Because when you look at what creates dominance and subordination under patriarchy, you see specific sex equality social issues that feminist branches tend to focus on, such as like reproductive freedom, like holding rapists accountable, pornography undermining sex equality because pornography is a system of harm which rewards men, or like LGBT rights because, hey, it's not a social norm. It's kind of out of the norm. You're violating the status quo for two people of the same sex to be together. So that has to do with treatment and expectations of gender when it comes to sex inequality. But yeah, Catherine McKinnon definitely would have said that, hey, pornography is wrong because it undermines sex inequality, because it's basically only protecting men's speech. Because pornography was, according to the Supreme Court, protected under the First Amendment rights. And so it's being considered as like a type of speech. But Catherine McKinnon is saying, like, no, it's using another person as speech. So it doesn't count. It's not the same thing as just voicing an opinion. You're basically using another person to perpetuate an act and then calling it speech. Whereas like that's and you're basically using pornography to shape social attitudes that view women in a certain way. And so it's basically inciting people to certain behaviors is and attitudes. So because like incitement isn't protected under the Constitution. Like you can't yell fire in a theater and then say, hey, because you yelled fire, that's protected under free speech. Like, no, you're inciting people. So basically, Catherine McKinnon is saying, like, for example, pornography is a sex inequality issue that results from dominance and subordination in society, and therefore is a social inequality issue that harms women. So, yeah. I think the class is getting the gist of like what I'm trying to say. But yeah, overall, feminist jurisprudence begs for like a non-dominant authority in law and life. And so when it's saying, hey, we believe in a non-dominant authority across the board, irregardless of like what branch of feminism you are, liberal, radical, socialist, postmodern, French feminist, like you believe in an equal dynamic when it comes to both the law and unwritten things that are in life. So, like, yeah. And then it's basically saying that, hey, sameness versus difference compared to dominance and subordination, it ultimately like it can be condensed down to a difference in power dynamic. Like it's dominance and subordination of like men viewing themselves higher up in the hierarchy than women because of like maybe like because of like just the status quo. That is like what is creating the power dynamic and is creating inequality in society versus like it actually being the differences and similarities that are perpetuating negative outcomes for women. Like basically feminist jurisprudence is saying that sameness and difference in women being argued as different than men and only similar somewhere else is just being used as like a scapegoat to oppress women because it's basically saying that, hey, feminist jurisprudence is basically arguing that, hey, it's wrong to expect women to have to be exactly the same like men. And if they refuse to be the same, that somehow they're unequal because they're not living to men's standards. That is oppression that's being used by men as an excuse to oppress them. Whereas, like, ironically enough, if women are different because of their psychological perspectives, some biological conditions, such as I said, pregnancy, those different traits are also being used as a scapegoat by men to say, no, 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 you're not equal, you're not living up to our standards. So basically, McKinnon is like, no, it's a power dynamic that is basically using sameness versus differences as excuses to oppress women, when really, like, the differences and sameness of men and women is completely irrelevant to whether they should have the same opportunities, value, and equality in society, because it ultimately is just about dominance and subordination of women, and like the dominance of the patriarchy wanting to overpower women that is creating inequality in society. And so, as like I wrote down here, McKinnon said female subordination and not due to difference socially subjects women under the patriarchy. Okay. And yeah, basically, I think that's the overall gist. I think just the biggest thing that we can take away from feminist jurisprudence is that, hey, all people are created equal. Like Martin Luther King said, it doesn't matter whether you're male, female, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, come from Mars. Like, you all have inherent value that makes society go around. And so Catherine McKinnon overall would say, hey, we need to appreciate diversity in society, because like the diversity in sex traits and what men and women contribute and their different perspectives and women's different experiences, which impact how they are harmed by the patriarchy and like their roles in society. Like, it's all those differences and perspectives that people learn through life and experience that gives good insights of how we can move forward to creating like a cultural shift towards leveling the playing field and eradicating gender inequality. So, yeah, feminist jurisprudence is just about, hey, give women their rights. And because of it, hey, I can own a credit card, I can go to college, I can join the military. Like, the world is my oyster. So that is the best way I could just summarize what Dimock's chapter 6 of feminist jurisprudence had to say. Okay, thank you for listening to my lecture today. Have a nice day. Bye. Okay. How do I